Thank you very much, and thanks for that introduction, each and every one of you for attending. If I can have my slides up. As introduced, I'm an internist and cardiologist and professor of medicine in Dallas, Texas, but I see patients and examine patients every day, and I've certainly seen my share of patients with acute COVID-19 and now COVID-19 vaccine injuries. So in the next several minutes, I'll outline the approach to outpatient treatment of COVID-19 with the goal of reducing hospitalizations and deaths. And from my perspective, this has been a giant blunder by public health authorities. There hasn't been a single public health authority in the world that stated that hospitalization and deaths are an important endpoint of COVID-19 and that we should make all efforts to prevent hospitalizations and death with medical therapy. Nobody said that. In fact, I was the first one to say it and do it in the peer-reviewed published literature and in the public domain. So with that, let's launch pathophysiologic basis and clinical rationale for early ambulatory treatment of COVID-19 and update on vaccine safety. Next slide. I'll follow this outline and make a few comments with respect to each one of these bullets. The first is, next slide, just the infection itself. Next slide. It's important to recognize there's three major components to the infection: viral proliferation, cytokine injury or inflammation, and then thrombosis. And so the characteristic signs and symptoms in laboratory tests are shown here. And the point is, it's a very long illness. COVID-19 is a potentially fatal illness, but it goes in slow motion. And in almost every person, it starts out as a very mild head cold. And we use intracellular anti-infectives, antiviral antibodies, corticosteroids, immunomodulators, antiplatelets, and agents and anticoagulants. It seems like a lot, but these are principles we use in the hospital, oftentimes when it's too late, and we advance them into early outpatient treatment in high-risk patients. That's where the real benefits are obtained. So next slide. Let's go through the pillars of pandemic response. Next slide. So I presented this at the U.S. Senate hearings on November 19th, 2020, and subsequently published the 4 pillars of pandemic response that I think every single government agency should have been on from the very beginning and should be on right now. Stopping the spread of the virus has been important, but it's largely unstoppable. Early home treatment is where all the benefit is in terms of reducing hospitalization and death. Early home treatment is the only opportunity to reduce spread of the virus, to shorten the duration and intensity of symptoms, and reduce hospitalization and death. It's the only pillar where we can do all of those. Late hospitalization and treatment many times is too late. The contemporary mortality for a patient admitted to an ICU in the top American hospital is 38%. It's simply too high. The hospital is too late. And the last pillar is herd immunity and vaccination. Next slide. So we've published on this that the biggest opportunity for reduction in the composite endpoint of hospitalization and death is what we call multifaceted, targeted, sequential, multi-drug treatment for COVID-19. And we do that when patients are in quarantine at home. Hospital care and then other activities as shown, including lockdowns and social distancing, they have a far less impact because they're not effective. They're not as strongly effective as early treatment is. Next slide. So there are a variety of things we can do. Next slide. The anti-spike protein antibodies are designer antibodies against the spike protein. The spike protein is the little spicule or the little spine sticking out of the ball of the virus. And this appropriately shows the antibodies are huge compared to the spike protein. And that's going to be a limitation of vaccines, as we'll talk about later on. But there are designer monoclonal antibodies. Next slide. In the United States, we have Regeneron and we have now GlaxoSmithKline. And on secondary endpoints, they do reduce hospitalizations that are beneficial. They're pre-purchased by the U.S. government. It takes a phone call for a doctor to order these. And patients get a 1-hour infusion in a sterile room, and then they go home. President Trump received this product. And in fact, it does work. Sadly, in the United States, our government pre-purchased 500 million doses of these monoclonal antibodies, and they sit on the shelves unused. Our government provides no access to these, no 1-800 numbers. They basically keep it a secret. And as our public is receiving mass propaganda morning, noon, and night about vaccination, sick patients with COVID-19 get no information on the availability of these valuable antibodies. And I think this is a real tragedy. Next slide. Hydroxychloroquine, the most widely used drug for COVID-19 in the world. Next slide. Well, why is hydroxychloroquine really the darling of COVID-19? Because we knew it reduced viral replication even before the pandemic. We knew this from SARS-CoV-1. Major countries appropriately stockpiled the drug, including the United States. And as shown here, hydroxychloroquine impairs the endosomal entry of the virus into the cell because it changes pH of the endosomes. It brings in zinc with it, and zinc goes to inhibit a polymerase that the virus is trying to use. And then lastly, hydroxychloroquine is an anti-inflammatory. It changes cell surface receptors, it improves innate immunity, and reduces inflammation. There's no single drug in COVID-19 that does all of these things as one single entity. Next slide. And so for that reason, hydroxychloroquine has had the most research. There's 259 completed trials. And in general, there is improvement in COVID-19 in terms of symptoms, in terms of reductions in hospitalizations and deaths when it started early. Next slide. Here's the largest clinical study of COVID-19. This was done in Iran. It was published in February of 2021. Next slide. And what it shows is that in 28,000 individuals that started early, about 25% of just the high-risk patients, a short course, 5 days with some additional medications, reduces hospitalizations and death by 30 and 60%, respectively. Now, this is not a randomized trial, and there have been no large randomized trials over 20,000 patients, and that's a giant mistake by governments. We had millions and millions of COVID-19 patients. There's no reason why every first world country couldn't have done large clinical trials, but they didn't do it, and so we have to rely on these data. Next slide. Of the randomized trials that were done as an outpatient, they were all very small and stopped early in the panic of the pandemic, but they do show an overall treatment effect with about a 24% relative risk reduction. So the randomized trials agree. Next slide. Ivermectin. Ivermectin is a drug, next slide, that reduces the nuclear entry of the virus once it's inside the cell, and it also has an inhibitory effect on the dangerous spike protein. So the mechanism of action of ivermectin is solid. Next slide. There are 60 trials completed with ivermectin, and virtually all of them are strongly positive. Next slide. Here's an analysis by Corey from the Frontline Critical Care Consortium demonstrating a 71% reduction in mortality when ivermectin is used, typically at 200 or 400 micrograms per kilogram. It means about 18 milligrams or so, typically given every other day for 3 doses or 5 doses, but there are different regimens. But importantly, observational studies and randomized trials agree. And unlike hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin seems to be versatile. So it seems to work when started early as well as started late. So ivermectin, in addition to hydroxychloroquine, are valuable components to the multi-drug program. No single drug completely treats COVID-19, but we use drugs in combination, just like we do with other fatal viral and bacterial infections, in order to reduce the risks of mortality. Next slide. Favipiravir. Favipiravir is like oral remdesivir. Next slide. And favipiravir inhibits the effect of a polymerase that the virus uses. But it takes a while for the virus to set up shop and then start using this RNA-dependent polymerase. And for that reason, favipiravir, just like remdesivir, is slow to work. But it's a Japanese product. It's approved in 5 countries, including Japan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and Kenya. It's used in 4 states in India. And it can be assistive. As the data suggest here, it's mildly effective. I think it's really kind of a distant second to ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, but it is an oral drug and it's safe. Next slide. Next slide. Corticosteroids. Next slide. A meta-analysis of corticosteroids, and it doesn't matter which one it is, dexamethasone, hydrocortisone, or prednisone, suggest about a 30% reduction in mortality. And prednisone is the most widely one used as an outpatient because it's available. It has standard dosing. It's much more balanced than dexamethasone. I think dexamethasone 6 milligrams was a very poor choice by the British group. And if that trial would have been redone with intravenous methylprednisolone or oral prednisone, I think it would have been much more positive. But having said that, my view, there's no reason to be wedded to dexamethasone. I think prednisone is the winner. And we use this as an outpatient routinely in our practice. Next slide. Next slide. Here's a trial of inhaled corticosteroids. So this was proposed originally by Dr. Richard Bartlett in Texas, but the British have done a trial, the STOIC trial, outpatients, inhaled budesonide. Next slide. And the dose was 800 micrograms twice a day for 14 days. It reduced the risk of hospitalization by 87%, and that was statistically significant. So we have randomized trial data for oral steroids when patients are later in the illness and have pulmonary symptoms, and then inhaled budesonide from the very beginning. Easy to prescribe and very safe. Next slide. Colchicine. Next slide. This is a COL-Corona trial. This is the highest quality clinical trial in all of COVID-19. It's better than all the inpatient studies. It's better than all the outpatient studies. This is prospective, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center, multi-country, and it's clear that colchicine, a anti-inflammatory drug given for 30 days, reduces hospitalization and death in those who are PCR positive. Next slide. The sample size was planned at 6,000. There's no reason to stop early, but they stopped early at 4,488, and they had a 4,159 that were PCR positive, and you see a 25% reduction in hospitalization and death. If this trial would have been continued to 6,000 patients, I think even on the global group, it would have hit a positive p-value. And again, no single one of these drugs cures COVID-19, but I'm showing you signals of benefit, acceptable safety, in order for us to put them into combinations as we would with any other infection. Next slide. Anticoagulants. Next slide. You can see here from inpatient studies, there is a reduced hazard when aspirin in full dose and parenteral anticoagulants, most commonly low molecular weight heparin, are used. Next slide. And then the benefit is carried out to 28 days in this multi-center analysis. So it's clear, because COVID-19 in the end kills patients because of blood clotting, we must use anticoagulants, aspirin 325 milligrams throughout, and even to protect against late thrombotic events at 325 milligrams. And then my personal choice is using full dose, low molecular weight heparin, enoxaparin, 80 milligrams subcutaneous twice a day is the standard dose. And this is extended even for longer term in patients at high risk for death, particularly seniors. Next slide. Okay, so how do we put this all together? Next slide. Sequence multi-drug therapy, and this was really the final breakthrough paper in December of 2020, the most frequently downloaded and utilized paper for the outpatient treatment of COVID-19, 57 authors, including many doctors who had frontline experience in using multi-drug protocols to reduce hospitalization and death. I've shared with you basically probably over 1,000 studies integrated to support the use of early outpatient treatment to reduce hospitalization and death. And I can tell you, it doesn't matter if patients have been vaccinated or not. When they get COVID-19 and they're high risk, this protocol should be followed. Next slide. So here's the program. Patients who develop COVID-19 should undergo self-quarantine, do contact tracing, and reduce spread of the illness. Patients can only spread the illness when they're acutely sick, typically with a fever. They cannot spread the illness when they have no symptoms. It's very important. So we only need to quarantine those who are sick. Doing lockdowns and restrictions on anybody who's not sick is not supported by the data, and in my view is fundamentally wrong. Age under 50 and healthy, those patients should get a nutraceutical bundle, which is reasonably assistive, zinc, vitamin D, vitamin C, and quercetin in the doses shown, undergo watchful waiting, and then complete their self-quarantine. It can be as short as 4 days, it all depends on symptoms, or as long as 2 weeks. If symptoms worsen, then they move into the treatment program down the middle. in the United States, in high-risk patients, we can order a monoclonal antibody infusion. We currently have Regeneron and GlaxoSmithKline. It's free of charge, and we can order this and get the infusion. I love to start high-risk seniors with a monoclonal antibody infusion, just like President Trump had, because it really works, and it makes the illness so much easier to treat. You saw how easy it was to treat President Trump. Then we used oral drugs, either hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, combining with doxycycline or zithromycin. These help to reduce viral replication. We use inhaled budesonide throughout now, and then at day 5 of respiratory symptoms, we add the use of prednisone. We use colchicine through the entire illness, 0.6 milligrams a day. And then in high-risk patients, we use aspirin 325 milligrams throughout, but we also use subcutaneous low-molecular heparin. We can use oxygen at home. In the United States, we have emergency use authorization that takes a phone call, and we can get an oxygen concentrator out to the patient's house. And doctors can use their judgment. You can see it takes about 4 to 6 prescription drugs. There are over-the-counter nutraceuticals. No single drug is curative. No single drug is a miracle drug, but we use the drugs in combination in order to get people through the illness. If we can treat a patient at home and there's no further spread of the virus outside the house, it is an absolute win. And I can tell you, we've relied on this protocol in thousands and thousands of patients. I currently have patients on this protocol right now, and it takes some internal medicine skill. It's not that difficult to do, and it's been executed all over the world. And I give a lot of credit to the early innovators of this, including Dr. Vladimir Zelenko, Dr. Didier Rialt, Dr. George Fareed, Brian Tyson, many who have contributed to this all over the world. Dr. Zavallo down in South America with ivermectin, Dr. Pierre Corey. Many people deserve credit for this. People have asked, what about other protocols? I said, yes, other protocols exist, and in general, they are subsets of what you're seeing on the slide. They are reduced versions. So the IMath and the Math Plus protocols of FLCC, they are reduced, less intense versions of the full multi-sequenced approach. How long do we have to continue these drugs? Well, on mild cases, we can go as short as 5 days. The average person my age, around 60, would take about 10 days of treatment. And then in patients who are senior citizens in senior homes, they may need 30 days of treatment. So it's a long illness. It's a mistake to stop early. Next slide. Well, in published studies, as you can see here, there's about an 85% reduction in hospitalization and death when multi-drug treatment is used, and multiple studies agree. There are no large randomized trials of multi-drug treatment, but the best observational and comparative studies show it clearly works. Next slide. Even in nursing homes, it doesn't matter what protocol is used. When something is done compared to nothing, there's about a 60% reduction in mortality. Next slide. Next slide. This was presented in historic U.S. Senate hearings, and it made a big splash and really it crushed our curve in the United States in January. So it was one of the most gratifying things ever. Next slide. And also in the Texas Senate, same presentation, we achieved herd immunity through this process. Next slide. Next slide. There are multiple treatment networks now in the United States, as well as worldwide, very effective. Next slide. We have a home treatment guide in the United States, shareable, aapsonline.org. Next slide. This is treatment domiciliary. They got to 0 cases of hospitalization with multi-drug treatment, had celebrations across Italy. Next slide. Let's move on to vaccine safety, and I see the time, so we're going to have to go fast. Next slide. There's great concern over vaccine safety, and many papers have been published on this, demanding a review of safety, which has not been done by any government in the world. Next slide. We're 6 months into this, and we have great concerns. There's a dangerous mechanism of action. There are no human ethics committee, no data safety monitoring board. There is vaccination of people excluded from the clinical studies with great harm being done. Next slide. Here are the most recent, we had a mortality safety signal January 22nd at 27 million people vaccinated. We had already been above an expected rate of mortality that we'd see. Next slide. Now you can see the deaths in the United States skyrocketing. There's no doubt about it. The vaccines are showing a very strong signal of mortality. Next slide. Here's the most recent numbers. 10,991 patients have died in the US after the vaccine. It's a complete and total biologic disaster. Next slide. You can see the deaths occur almost immediately after the vaccine. Next slide. In this analysis, next slide, by McLachlan, 86% of the deaths have no other explanation than the vaccine. Next slide. You can see here from this analysis, most are elderly and it occurs very quickly. The vaccine is almost immediately deadly in seniors. Next slide. In this analysis by Rose, very similar, about 50% of the deaths within 24 hours, 80% within a week. The non-fatal reactions occur and the permanent injuries occur in the younger individuals. Next slide. The vaccines are failing. These data from Israel show now that 80% of people who have COVID-19 are fully vaccinated. This is with the Pfizer vaccine, which has the weakest of overall coverage against epitopes in the spike protein. Next slide. Dr. Tess Lowry and evidence-based consulting group say that vaccines are not fit for human use and should be withdrawn. Next slide. Novavax is coming. This is an antigen-based vaccine. It may be much safer than the genetic vaccines. Looks just as good as Pfizer and Moderna. Next slide. So to finish and conclude, next slide. COVID-19 is a pandemic, a global disaster. Pathophysiology is complex, not amenable to a single drug. Despite contagion control efforts, which have failed, 2 poor outcomes, hospitalization and death. In the pre-hospital phase, there's a time for therapeutic opportunity, particularly as the vaccines fail. We need to treat patients who are acutely sick. Hospitalization and late treatment form an inadequate safety net, unacceptably high mortality. We cannot railroad people into the hospital. Early ambulatory treatment with sequence multi-drug therapy is safe and effective and should be done in each and every high-risk case. COVID-19 genetic vaccines, unfavorable safety profile, cannot be generally supported in clinical practice at this time. Thank you so much for listening.